I will answer the question. I want to be precise about that before I proceed. The inquiry board has asked me a great many things over the past 3 days, and I have observed considerable patience with the phrasing of your questions, with the intervals between them, with the careful administrative language in which they are wrapped. I have sat here at this table, in this chamber, with the light from that viewport falling across the left side of my face, and I have watched each of you compose your expressions into studied neutrality. I respect the effort. I have been in enough formal chambers to know what studied neutrality costs a person. But I want to be direct with you about something before we begin today's session in earnest. You have been asking me variations of the same question for 3 days. The language changes, the framing shifts. You ask about scope, then proportionality, then mandate, then operational parameters. Last evening, the board chair used the phrase degree of response relative to the originating act. This morning, Delegate Merle framed it as a question of whether the fleet's actions fell within the bounds of recognized reprisal doctrine. These are all the same question. I understand that. I am 71 years old, and I commanded the 9th Combined Battle Group, and afterward the documented evidence fleet itself. And I have had this question posed to me in every grammatical configuration a formal inquiry can manage. I will answer it once clearly, and I will not answer it again. But I need to tell you what I know first, because the question cannot be answered without the record, and the record is the point. The record is, in fact, everything. My name is Karas Ven. I held the rank of Admiral, 1st Combined Fleet Authority, from the 23rd year of the Compact of Vethrani Reach until my retirement in the 4th year following the completion of documented evidence operations. I commanded the documented evidence fleet for the duration of those operations, 39 days, 11 systems, 9 primary installations, and the full administrative and military infrastructure of the Vethrani Dominion as it existed at the commencement of operations on day 1. I am answering your questions under voluntary provision. I was not compelled to appear. I want that in the record as well because I think it matters. The Dominion could not compel me. The Compact has chosen not to. I am here because I believe the record should be complete. I believe that with the same cold conviction I have believed anything in my life. The record should be complete. That is, I will tell you, the thread that runs through everything I am about to say. I will begin with the specimen protocols. I understand that members of this board have read the Dominion's own documentation of those protocols. I understand that some of you have reviewed the academic literature. I want to establish for this record what I knew when operations commenced and what the fleet understood as its mandate. The specimen protocols were first codified by the Vethrani Dominion's Bureau of Xenobiological Inquiry in the 4th year of the Dominion's contact period with human space. At that time, human settlements in the outer ring were sparse. The Dominion's survey elements had cataloged 9 established colony systems and estimated a further 40 settlements in various stages of development. The Bureau's founding charter, which I have read and which has been entered into this board's evidence file, describes its mandate as, and I am going to read this phrase precisely, the systematic documentation of xenobiological response patterns across contact period species for the advancement of Dominion scientific understanding. I want you to hold that language. The advancement of Dominion scientific understanding. The specimen protocols, as operationalized, worked as follows. Dominion survey vessels operating in the outer ring would identify human individuals, typically in small settlements, transit vessels, or survey stations where the absence of the individual could be attributed to accident, equipment failure, or the ordinary hazards of outer ring life. The individuals were taken, not killed, taken. Transported to one of the Dominion's 9 cataloging stations, distributed across 7 systems at distances carefully chosen to discourage any meaningful human search effort. At the cataloging stations, The individuals were housed in what the Dominion's own records describe as observation units. The documentation that preceded my operational orders used different language. The documentation prepared by Earth's Assessment Commission described the observation units as cells, 4 meters by 2.5 meters, temperature controlled to what Dominion biologists had determined was a human comfort range, lighting on a cycle calibrated to human circadian rhythms. The Dominion's biologists were thorough. They had read the xenobiology literature. They knew what conditions produced the most stable baseline response patterns in the study population. The individuals were fed. They were kept in reasonable physical health for the purpose of the research. They were exposed to stimuli and their responses were recorded. They were observed. They were photographed. They were subjected to what the Dominion's literature calls passive interaction protocols, which is a phrase that required the Assessment Commission 17 months to fully unpack, and which I will not detail in full here because this board has access to the Commission's report, and I do not propose to make this testimony longer than it needs to be. I will say only this. The passive interaction protocols involve the exposure of the study population to conditions, stimuli, and experiences that the Dominion's researchers understood would produce observable stress responses, fear responses, social bonding responses, and what their literature calls separation distress indicators. The researchers were measuring how humans behave when frightened, isolated, grieving, and desperate. They were measuring it carefully, over extended periods, and they were publishing their findings. 214 peer-reviewed papers in Dominion academic journals over 23 years. I have read all of them. My intelligence staff compiled a full translation index. The papers are well organized, rigorously footnoted, and written with the confident clarity of researchers who had no expectation that anyone outside the Dominion's academic community would ever read them. The Dominion published them because they were proud of them. I want you to understand that. The Dominion's Bureau of Xenobiological Inquiry published 114 papers in the first 12 years of the program, and 100 additional papers in the final 11. The publication rate was accelerating. The research was considered a significant contribution to Dominion science. The lead researcher on the protocols, a figure whose name appears on 71 of those papers, received the Dominion's highest academic honor in the 18th year of the program. There was a ceremony. The documentation includes photographs. 4,887,304 humans were cataloged under the specimen protocols over those 23 years. That number requires some explanation, because I want to be precise about what it means and what it does not mean. It is the number of individual human beings who were taken. Some individuals were taken more than once, transferred between stations, returned to the outer ring when their physiological indicators suggested they were no longer producing useful baseline data, recaptured at a later date. The Commission's methodology counted each individual once, regardless of how many times they were processed through the system. Of the 4,887,304 individuals cataloged, the Commission was able to establish with high confidence that 3,211,907 died in Dominion custody. Not as a result of deliberate termination. The protocols did not include termination as a research outcome. They died because captivity over extended periods kills human beings, and because the conditions in the observation units, despite the Dominion's careful calibration of temperature and circadian lighting, were not conditions in which human beings survive indefinitely. The average duration of captivity before death was 4 years and 7 months. Some individuals lived significantly longer. A small number were held for over a decade. The Commission identified 412,887 individuals who were returned to the outer ring. Of those, the Commission's psychological assessment teams were able to locate and evaluate 211,003 survivors. I am not going to describe the evaluation findings in detail. The Commission's report is available to this board. I will say that the Commission's chief psychological assessor, a woman named Dea Morin who spent 11 years on the assessment work, and who lost her own sister to a cataloging station in the 7th year of the protocols, used the word intact in her summary evaluation for 43 of the 211,003 survivors she evaluated. 43. She defined intact as meaning that the individual was able, without assistance, to provide a coherent account of their captivity. The remaining 1,262,510 individuals in the total catalog were unaccounted for. The Commission's working assumption, based on station records recovered during operations, is that the majority of those individuals are also dead. The station records were not always complete. The Dominion's researchers were diligent about documenting results, but less diligent about documenting disposal. That is the named offense. I want to be certain this board understands it, because the question you have been asking me for 3 days, the question of proportionality, cannot be answered in the abstract. It can only be answered in relation to a specific, named, documented thing. The specific, named, documented thing is this. For 23 years, the Vethrani Dominion ran a program of capturing living human beings, holding them in cells, studying their fear and grief and desperation as scientific data, publishing the findings in peer-reviewed journals, and awarding academic honors to the researchers who produced the most interesting results. The program was legal under Vethrani administrative law. I have read the relevant statutes. The Commission's legal team produced a thorough analysis. The protocols were authorized under the Bureau of Xenobiological Inquiry's founding charter, reviewed by the Dominion's Administrative Oversight Council in the 9th year, found to be in full compliance with Dominion scientific ethics standards, and renewed for a further 15-year authorization period. There was no violation of Dominion law. The Dominion's legal community had no objection. The protocols were not illegal under the Compact of Vethrani Reach because the Compact, at the time the protocols were running, did not include the Vethrani Dominion as a signatory member. The Dominion had observer status. Observer status carries no binding obligations. I am providing this legal background because I want the board to understand precisely what Earth was working with when the protocols were discovered. There was no existing mechanism. There was no enforcement body with jurisdiction. There was no treaty clause that could be invoked. There was no process of formal complaint that would produce any result in any time frame that had meaning for the human beings still alive in cataloging stations when the Commission completed its preliminary findings. The discovery occurred in the 31st year of contact, as counted from the Vethrani Dominion's initial survey of outer ring human space. It was made by a freight hauler crew operating a standard cargo run between the Pelith transfer station and the settlement on Heron's Outer. The hauler experienced a navigation malfunction that pushed it into a transit corridor not listed on any published chart. In that corridor, at the edge of a system with no registered name in any human database, the hauler's passive sensor array detected a structure. The captain, a woman named Ursula Fan who had been running outer ring freight for 19 years, recognized that the structure was not a natural formation and was not a registered installation of any kind. She logged it, continued to Heron's Outer, and filed a discrepancy report with the Compact's Outer Ring Survey Authority. The Outer Ring Survey Authority sent a survey team 14 months later. The survey team sent a commission request 4 months after that. The Assessment Commission took 17 months to produce its preliminary findings, at which point Earth's Combined Fleet Authority had been notified, and I had been given my operational orders. The total time from Ursula Fan's discrepancy report to my receipt of operational orders was 37 months. I want to be clear about what was happening in those 37 months. The Commission was working. Earth's government was deliberating. The legal teams were analyzing. The diplomatic channels were explored. I will not characterize the diplomatic effort as perfunctory because it was not. Earth's diplomatic staff spent 11 of those 37 months in formal and informal contact with the Vethrani Dominion's administrative apparatus, communicating through the Compact's observer status notification protocols, requesting meetings, submitting documentation requests, asking the Dominion to provide access to Commission investigators. The Dominion's responses, which I have also read in full, were consistent. They were polite. They were administratively thorough. They acknowledged receipt of Earth's communications, confirmed that the communications had been reviewed by appropriate Dominion officials, and noted that the specimen protocols were a matter of internal Dominion scientific administration that fell outside the scope of the Compact's observer status framework. Two of the responses included expressions of appreciation for Earth's interest in xenobiological research, and offered, as a gesture of collaborative goodwill, to provide redacted summaries of published research findings. In the 31st month of those 37 months, the Assessment Commission confirmed that 3 of the 9 cataloging stations were still actively operational. Human beings were still being held in those stations. The Commission's estimate, based on station capacity analysis and operational indicators, was that between 14,000 and 22,000 individuals were currently in Dominion custody across the 3 active stations. Earth's government issued a formal demand for immediate cessation of operations and release of all held individuals in the 32nd month. The Dominion's response, received 11 days later, acknowledged receipt of the demand and reiterated that the protocols were a matter of internal Dominion scientific administration. The response was 3 paragraphs long. The 3rd paragraph thanked Earth's government for its ongoing engagement with the Compact's observer status dialogue process. I received my operational orders in the 37th month. My orders were precise. I have been asked by this board whether I found them unusual in any respect. I did not. They were the most precise operational orders I had received in 41 years of service, and I found them clear and complete. The fleet's mandate was the dismantlement of all 9 cataloging stations and all Vethrani Dominion military, administrative, and governmental infrastructure across all 11 systems in which Dominion installations existed. The mandate specified that all station records were to be secured and preserved. It specified that the fleet was to conduct a full census of all individuals found in cataloging station facilities. It specified the rules of engagement for Dominion military contact, which I will summarize as follows. No Dominion military vessel that engaged the fleet would be allowed to withdraw. The orders did not specify what I was to leave standing at the end of 39 days. That determination was left to my discretion. I have been asked whether I found this unusual. I did not find it unusual. I found it appropriate. The people who wrote my orders understood that some things cannot be specified in advance. Some determinations require presence. They require the experience of having walked through 9 cataloging stations and counted what you find there, and standing in a control room where the walls are lined with filed research documentation, and reading the abstracts of the papers tacked to a planning board above a researcher's workstation, and making a decision that is not in any operational order because it could not have been written in an operational order, because it had to be arrived at. I will tell you about the fleet first, because the fleet is part of the answer to your question. The documented evidence fleet assembled at Vethrani Outer Reach in the 2nd week of the operational period, 677 warships, 8 carrier battle groups and the assessment screen. I had requested the assessment screen specifically, and I want the board to understand why, because it is germane to the question of mandate. The assessment screen was 32 vessels configured for documentary, forensic, and communication operations rather than combat. They carried assessment teams, forensic specialists, medical personnel, psychological evaluators, translation staff, communication technicians. They were the part of the fleet that was not there to dismantle things. They were there to document what we found and to ensure that documentation was accurate, complete, and preserved. I named the fleet the Documented Evidence Fleet because I wanted the fleet's name to reflect its purpose. This was not a standard practice. Fleet designations are typically administrative and sequential. I submitted the name with my operational plan and it was approved without comment. I wanted every officer and crew member in that fleet to understand, from the name of the formation they were serving in, what we were doing. We were not simply responding to an act. We were completing a record. The first system entered was the Vethrani Dominion's outer administrative hub, which the Commission had designated System 11 in its preliminary findings. There were no cataloging stations in System 11. It held the Dominion's Outer Ring Fleet Command installation, 3 administrative relay stations, and a shipyard complex with a capacity the Commission had estimated at approximately 40 warships in various states of construction and readiness. The Dominion's Outer Ring Fleet Command installation responded to our arrival with a challenge transmission. The challenge transmission invoked Vethrani administrative protocols and demanded that the fleet identify itself, state its authorization, and hold position pending review. I responded with a transmission of my own. My transmission was brief. I stated the fleet's name. I stated the number of vessels in the fleet. I stated that our authorization was the 4,887,304 individuals cataloged under the Vethrani specimen protocols. I stated that the fleet's operations would commence in 4 hours. The Dominion's installation transmitted 11 follow-up messages in those 4 hours. My communications staff logged them. I did not respond to any of them. At the 4-hour mark, operations commenced. System 11 was cleared in 9 hours. 2 Dominion warships engaged the fleet. Neither withdrew. The shipyard was dismantled. The administrative relay stations were dismantled. The Outer Ring Fleet Command installation was dismantled. The assessment screen teams boarded and documented all accessible records before dismantlement. I want to say something about the word dismantled, because I have used it several times and I want to be precise about its meaning as I intend it. I do not mean destroyed in the sense of reduced to gas and debris. The fleet's operations were methodical. Installations were taken apart. Power systems were deactivated. Structural components were separated from functional systems. In some cases, this process produced significant observable damage. In other cases, it was more orderly. The result in every case was that the installation ceased to function as an installation. It could not be reactivated. It could not be repurposed. It no longer existed as a working facility. I chose this approach deliberately. Faster methods were available to me. I did not use them because I wanted the record to reflect what we had found. I wanted the assessment teams to have time. I wanted the documentation to be thorough. The fleet moved through the 11 systems in the order established by the operational plan, which I had organized to prioritize the 3 active cataloging stations. System 7 held the first active station. We reached it on day 6. I have been in a great many places in 41 years of service. I have seen what war does to installations, to infrastructure, to the physical architecture of a civilization's ability to sustain itself. I have commanded operations on the ground and from a bridge, and from an assessment shuttle flying over the aftermath of things I ordered. I am not a person who is easily affected by the physical appearance of a facility. I want to tell you what the cataloging station in System 7 looked like, because I think it belongs in the record. It was built into the rock of an airless moon. The Dominion's engineers had used the moon's natural geology as structural support. The installation's outer walls were the moon itself, reinforced and sealed, so that from the outside the structure was nearly invisible. The assessment shuttle had to use active scanning to locate the access points. This, the Commission's structural analysts noted in their preliminary report, was a deliberate design choice. The cataloging stations were built to be undetectable from the outside. The Dominion's researchers were not expecting to be found. The interior was organized around a central atrium, which the Dominion's architectural documentation, because they had documented everything, described as a multi-purpose observation and administrative hub. Off the atrium in 3 wings were the observation units. The cells, 4 meters by 2.5 meters, temperature controlled, lighting on a circadian cycle. There were 4,112 individuals in the System 7 station when the assessment screen teams entered. I want to say that number again because I want this board to hear it clearly. 4,112 individuals in a station built into the rock of an airless moon in a system with no registered name. Some of them had been there for months. Some of them had been there for years. The oldest file in the station's active research registry was 9 years and 4 months old. The assessment teams moved through the wings, and the assessment teams did their work, which was to count and document and evaluate and provide immediate medical care, and I received their reports on my bridge in real time. I read every report as it came in. I was not required to do this. My operations staff managed the tactical situation. I read the reports because I believed I should know what was in that station, and I believed that I should know it in the same real time in which the assessment teams were learning it. It seemed to me that this was the minimum I owed to the 4,112 individuals in those cells, that the person commanding the fleet that had come to complete the record should be reading the record as it was made. I will not give you the details of those reports. The Commission's full assessment is available to this board. I will tell you that when the assessment teams completed their initial census of System 7, I asked my communications officer to transmit the census numbers to Earth's Combined Fleet Authority with the notation that the documented evidence fleet had found the station active and had begun the evacuation and assessment process. I asked him to include in the transmission the number of individuals found in the station, their estimated period of captivity as recorded in the Dominion's own station files, and the date stamp from the most recent research entry in the station's active log, which was 4 days before we arrived. 4 days before we arrived, a Dominion researcher had filed a report on a stress response protocol administered to a group of 7 individuals in Wing 3. The report was formatted in the same standard template as all 214 of the Dominion's published papers. It included a summary, a methodology section, a results table, and a brief discussion of implications for future research. It was awaiting editorial review for potential submission to the Dominion's Journal of Xenobiological Studies. The researcher was still in the station when we arrived. He was in his office when the assessment teams reached his wing. The assessment team's report describes him as cooperative. He provided his research credentials. He asked, through a translator, whether his files would be preserved, because they represented nearly 8 years of continuous data collection, and he considered the longitudinal consistency to be the study's primary scientific value. The assessment team leader, a compact military officer named Davin Ressler, who had spent 2 years on commission preliminary work before joining the fleet, recorded this exchange in her report. I have read her report many times. I want to read you the final line of her account of that exchange, because I think it belongs in the testimony record. She wrote, "He seemed genuinely concerned about the data. He did not seem to understand why I was looking at him the way I was looking at him. I do not think he had ever had occasion to consider that someone might look at him that way." The Dominion researchers' files were preserved. All files in all 9 stations were preserved. That was in my orders, and it was also my own conviction, and the two aligned perfectly. The System 7 station was cleared of its 4,112 individuals in 41 hours. Evacuation transports from the assessment screen carrier group moved the individuals to a holding and medical facility that the Compact's Relief Authority had positioned at the outer edge of the system before operations commenced. The station's research files were imaged in full by the documentation teams. Then the station was dismantled. The second active station was in System 4. We reached it on day 11. System 4 held the largest cataloging station in the Dominion's network. The Commission's pre-operational estimates had projected a population of 7,000 to 12,000 individuals. The actual census came to 9,847. The station had 3 wings and a secondary processing facility connected by a subsurface transit corridor. The research archive was extensive. The documentation teams worked for 72 hours before they had completed a full imaging of the station's files. System 4's station was also the oldest of the 3 active facilities. Its earliest construction documentation was dated to the 2nd year of the specimen protocols, which meant it had been operational for 21 years. The assessment teams found evidence of multiple renovation cycles in the wing layouts, expansions, reconfiguration of the observation unit clusters, upgrades to the environmental control systems. The Dominion had invested in the facility over 2 decades. They had maintained it. They had improved it as their understanding of optimal research conditions developed. The station director was found in the administrative block. He was 74 years old, and he had been running the System 4 station for 16 of its 21 years. His personnel file, which his own station's archive contained in full, reflected a career dedicated entirely to xenobiological research. He had joined the Bureau of Xenobiological Inquiry in his early career, transferred to the cataloging station program in its 3rd year, and had risen to the station director role through a series of promotions that the personnel records described as merited. He had authored 41 of the 214 published papers, more than any researcher except the program's lead figure. He had trained 11 junior researchers over his career at the station. Their names appeared in the acknowledgement sections of their own subsequent papers. He cooperated fully with the assessment teams. He provided access codes, administrative records, personnel files, and the research archives indexing system without being asked twice for any of them. The assessment team leader's report noted that he seemed to believe that cooperation would be advantageous to him. It also noted that he seemed, through the hours of processing and documentation, to be composing arguments in his head, that his demeanor suggested he was preparing to make a case that the research had been of genuine scientific value. He did not, ultimately, have the opportunity to make that case to anyone who would receive it. The assessment team's work was documentation, not adjudication. His files went into the archive with everything else. While the documentation teams worked in System 4, the combat elements of the fleet continued through System 8, System 3, and System 9, dismantling the inactive cataloging stations and the Dominion's military installations in each system. The inactive stations held no living individuals, but their research archives were intact. The station files recorded the full history of the research conducted at each facility, including intake records, observation logs, outcome records, and publication submissions. In System 9's inactive station, the documentation teams found a physical archive room containing printed copies of all 214 published papers, bound and cataloged, maintained as an institutional record of the station's contribution to Dominion science. I was informed of this archive room by a documentation team report on day 14. I asked the team leader to ensure that the archive was imaged in full and that the physical copies were preserved intact for transfer to the Commission. He confirmed that this had been done. I want to note something about the inactive stations that this board has not asked me about, but that I think belongs in the record. The inactive stations, the 6 facilities that were no longer running active research programs at the time of operations, had been closed not because the Dominion had reconsidered the protocols, but because the research programs at those stations had reached what the Bureau's administrative records described as data saturation. The station directors had determined that the studies at those facilities had produced sufficient data for their current research objectives, and the stations had been administratively closed, pending new research proposals that would justify reactivation. The administrative records for the inactive stations included planning documents for potential reactivation. 3 of the 6 inactive stations had pending Bureau proposals that contemplated resuming operations within 2 to 5 years, pending funding authorization. The proposals outlined new research directions, new study populations, new methodologies. They were written in the confident future tense of researchers planning the next stage of a productive program. Those proposals are in the archive as well. The 3rd active station was in System 2. We reached it on day 19. The 3rd station's population was 6,231. It was the oldest of the 3 active stations. The Commission's pre-operational assessment had placed its initial construction in the 4th year of the specimen protocols. The station's physical infrastructure showed its age. The observation units in Wing 1 were from the original construction phase. The design differed slightly from the Dominion's later standardized units, suggesting that the program's early architects had not yet settled on the optimal configuration for the research environment. There was a woman in Wing 1, in Unit 7 of the original construction phase, who had been in that station for 11 years and 3 months. I know this because the station's file was current. The Dominion's researchers were diligent about their record-keeping. She had been cataloged in the 12th year of the protocols, taken from a transit vessel in the outer reach of the Vethrani border zone, where human freight traffic had begun to expand as the compact's outer ring settlements grew. She was 31 years old when she was taken. She was 42 years old when the assessment team reached Wing 1. The assessment team's report noted that she was ambulatory, that her physical indicators were consistent with long-term captivity in the conditions the station maintained, and that she had been the subject of 37 separate research entries in the station's active log over her 11 years and 3 months. 37 entries, each one formatted in the Dominion's standard template, each one contributing to the longitudinal data set that the station's lead researcher considered his most significant scientific contribution. I read that report sitting in my command chair on the bridge of the fleet's flagship, the vessel we had named the Accountability of Record, and I made a decision that I had been arriving at since day 6 but had not yet fully articulated to myself. I want to describe that decision clearly, because it is the core of what this board is asking me. By day 23, when the System 2 station had been cleared, and the last of its 6,231 individuals had been transferred to the Relief Authority's facilities, the fleet had worked through 9 of the 11 target systems. The remaining 2 systems held the Vethrani Dominion's primary administrative capital and its central fleet command installation. These were the largest and most heavily defended installations in the Dominion's network. They were also the installations that held the Dominion's central academic archives. The central academic archives were, by the Commission's pre-operational inventory, the primary repository for all specimen protocols research. The published papers had been distributed to Dominion academic journals, but the underlying data, the raw observation records, the intake documentation, the full longitudinal files, the unpublished research, the internal communications between the Bureau of Xenobiological Inquiry and the Dominion's Administrative Oversight Council. All of it existed in its most complete form in the Central Archives. My operational orders specified that the Central Archives were to be secured and preserved before dismantlement of the facilities that housed them. This I did. But the question of what to do with those archives once they were secured was mine to answer. My orders gave me discretion. I exercised it. On day 26, the fleet's documentation teams completed the full imaging of the Dominion's central academic archives. The imaging produced a data set of considerable size. The documentation team's chief technical officer, a man named Oren Peleth who had spent 30 years in fleet communications and archive work, described it to me as the most comprehensive single data transfer he had overseen in his career. He was not being dramatic. The archive was thorough. The Dominion had kept everything. I asked Peleth how long it would take to prepare the archive for broadcast transmission on the standard compact open-channel network. He looked at me for a moment before answering. He had been with me since the fleet assembled, and he had seen the assessment reports, and he understood what I was asking. He told me he could have a broadcast package ready within 48 hours. I told him to proceed. The last two systems, the Dominion's administrative capital and the Central Fleet Command installation, were reached on days 27 through 33. The administrative capital presented the fleet's most sustained military engagement of the entire operation. The Dominion's Central Fleet Command installation had gathered approximately 60% of the Dominion's remaining combat-capable warships, and they met us in the outer system. The engagement lasted 19 hours. No Dominion vessel withdrew. After the engagement, the fleet moved to the administrative capital itself. The government of the Vethrani Dominion transmitted a series of communications during the approach. The first set attempted to invoke emergency provisions under the Compact's observer status framework, requesting that the fleet stand down pending an emergency session of the Compact's administrative assembly. The second set shifted to direct negotiation, offering terms of cessation, offering compensatory frameworks, offering access to the central archives in exchange for a halt to fleet operations. The third and final set, transmitted in the last 6 hours before the fleet reached the administrative capital's inner defense perimeter, were not addressed to me. They were addressed to the Compact's administrative assembly directly, and they invoked the language of civilizational survival. My communication staff logged all of them. I did not respond. The administrative capital was dismantled over 4 days, from day 28 through day 31. The Dominion's governmental infrastructure, its administrative offices, its judicial apparatus, its legislative chambers, its financial systems, its diplomatic services, was dismantled with the same methodical care that the fleet had applied to every other installation in the 11 systems. The assessment teams documented everything before dismantlement. The Central Fleet Command installation was the last military target. It was reached on day 32. The installation was defended by a small number of remaining Dominion warships, vessels that had either not been at the capital engagement or had survived it. The engagement was brief. No vessel withdrew. By the end of day 32, the 11 systems were cleared. The fleet held position. On day 33, I convened the fleet's senior staff on the accountability of records primary briefing deck. My operations officer, my intelligence director, my communications director, Peleth, and the senior assessment screen commander. I presented them with what I intended to do on day 39, and I asked for their assessments. This was standard procedure. I consulted my senior staff on significant operational decisions throughout the campaign. I am noting it specifically for this record because I want the board to understand that what followed on day 39 was not an unilateral impulse. It was a considered command decision, made deliberately, with input, by officers who had spent 39 days reading the same reports I had read and walking through the same stations I had walked through. My operations officer said that the action was within fleet mandate and that he had no operational objection. My intelligence director said that the action would have significant and lasting effects on Dominion interests in the galactic academic community, that the broadcast would reach institutions and governments that had no prior knowledge of the protocols, and that she wanted all of that noted in the record. My communications director confirmed that the technical execution was feasible within the time frame. Peleth said nothing for a moment, and then he said, "Good." The assessment screen commander, a woman named Hale Doran who had spent 2 years on the Commission's preliminary work and who had personally led the documentation teams in 3 of the 9 stations, said, "Make certain the image quality on the station's 7 files is sufficient for the photographs. I want every face visible. I want every face visible at the broadcast resolution." I told her I would ensure it. The remaining days 33 through 38, were occupied with the final documentation work, the transfer of the relief authorities' patient populations to compact medical facilities, the fleet's administrative closure procedures, and Peleth's preparation of the broadcast package. I want to describe what the broadcast package contained, because it is the core of my answer to this board's question. The broadcast package contained the complete Vethrani Dominion specimen protocols archive. All research documentation, all station files, all intake records, all observation logs, all outcome records, all correspondence between the Bureau of Xenobiological Inquiry and the Dominion's Administrative Oversight Council, all internal memoranda, all budget authorizations, all staffing records, all equipment procurement records, all construction documentation for the 9 cataloging stations, all 214 published academic papers with their raw underlying data, all unpublished research and draft submissions, and all photographs. Every photograph that existed in the archive, from the initial survey images that the Dominion's researchers had used to plan the protocols through the documentation photographs in the individual station files. The archive, once assembled, constituted the most complete account of the specimen protocols that existed anywhere. It was more complete than the Assessment Commission's report. It was more complete than Earth's own documentation. The Dominion had kept everything. Their record-keeping was exemplary. In 23 years of running the protocols, they had not discarded a single document because they had no reason to discard anything. They had not expected to be found, and they were proud of their work. Peleth added one element to the broadcast package that was not from the Dominion's archive. He added the Assessment Commission's census, the full accounting of 4,887,304 named individuals, cross-referenced against the station files wherever a cross-reference was possible. The Commission had spent 17 months building that census. It was the most complete record Earth had of who had been taken. It was not complete. The Commission had been able to identify with certainty approximately 60% of the total, but it was what existed. Peleth formatted it as the opening document of the broadcast package, so that it would be the first thing any recipient encountered. I am noting Peleth's addition for the record. I approved it. I believe it was correct. On day 39, the documented evidence fleet transmitted the broadcast package on all standard compact open channel frequencies, all compact emergency broadcast frequencies, all known Dominion communication frequencies, and 12 additional non-compact frequencies that covered the principal diplomatic and academic networks of the galactic community, as known to Earth's intelligence services at that time. The transmission was continuous. The package was transmitted in full, without redaction, in every language for which a translation existed in the fleet's archives, with untranslated originals attached. The transmission ran for 11 hours before the full package had been sent. The fleet maintained broadcast position for a further 24 hours to ensure full receipt confirmation from compact relay stations. At the conclusion of the 24-hour confirmation period, the fleet turned for home. I want to tell you what I left standing. I left the Dominion's academic archive standing, not the physical archive that had been dismantled along with everything else, but its contents, every document, every photograph, every paper, the record that the Dominion had built over 23 years, confident that it would persist as a contribution to scientific understanding and as a monument to the rigor of Vethrani inquiry. I did not leave it standing as a monument to the Dominion. I left it standing as an answer. The Dominion had made the most thorough record they could of 4,887,304 people. They had documented every intake, every observation, every response, every outcome. They had photographed everything. They had written it all down in the standard template and submitted it for peer review. They had filed it carefully in their central archives and maintained those archives with admirable institutional consistency for 23 years. I made certain that record was complete. I made certain that every system with a receiver capable of receiving it received it. I made certain that every government, every academic institution, every diplomatic body, every species with representation in the galactic community received the Dominion's own account of what they had done, in the Dominion's own words, with the Dominion's own photographs, with the Assessment Commission's census attached as the opening document so that the record began with the people rather than the science. That is what the fleet did on day 39. We transmitted the Dominion's record. We made it complete. We made it permanent. We made certain it could not be lost or archived or quietly allowed to fade from the community's attention the way that administrative inconveniences tend to fade. This board has been asking me for 3 days whether the fleet's response was proportionate to the originating act. Before I give you my answer, I want to address something this board raised on the first day of testimony, because I think it has been shaping your questions in ways that have made the past 3 days less efficient than they could have been. Delegate Merle asked, on that first day, whether Earth had exhausted its non-military options before committing the fleet. I answered at the time that Earth had pursued diplomatic channels for 11 of the 37 months between Orsil Fan's discrepancy report and my operational orders, and the board moved on. But I do not think you have fully absorbed what that question means in this context, and I want to address it now. The question of whether diplomatic options were exhausted assumes that diplomatic options in the relevant sense existed. They did not. A diplomatic option, in the sense that the reprisal doctrine literature contemplates, is a mechanism by which the offending party can be brought to understand that their actions have caused harm and to take steps to remedy that harm. This mechanism functions when the offending party shares a framework in which the harm is recognizable as harm. It functions when there is a pressure, commercial, political, reputational, or security-based, that can be applied to change behavior. It functions when the offending party's calculations can be shifted by the prospect of consequences. None of these conditions obtained with respect to the Vethrani Dominion and the specimen protocols. The Dominion did not recognize the protocols as harmful because within their framework the protocols were not harmful. They were scientifically productive. They were institutionally celebrated. They had been running for 23 years without internal objection because there was no Dominion voice that had the institutional standing or the conceptual framework to object to them. Earth's communications, which communicated, as clearly as diplomatic language permits, that the protocols were an atrocity, landed in a Dominion administrative culture that had no category for that communication. The responses I described earlier, polite, thorough, rerouting Earth's concerns into the observer status framework, were not strategic deflection. They were genuine administrative processing. The Dominion's officials who drafted those responses did not understand what Earth was saying, because what Earth was saying required a prior understanding that they did not have, that the humans in those stations were people. The pressure levers were similarly absent. The Dominion's economy had no significant dependency on trade with human space. The Dominion's political standing in the galactic community did not depend on its relationship with Earth. The Dominion's military posture was calibrated around threats that did not include the prospect of Earth's response, because the Dominion had not, in 11 months of diplomatic contact, updated its assessment of what Earth would do. Their military planning assumptions, which we recovered from the Fleet Command installations records, listed Earth as a low-threat outer-ring species with no demonstrated capacity for organized military action beyond colony defense. Those assessments had not been revised since the contact period began. The Dominion's intelligence services had been watching human space for 31 years, and they had concluded that we were not a species that would assemble 677 warships. They were wrong. But they were wrong in a way that diplomatic engagement could not correct, because the error was not a miscalculation they were open to revising. It was a conclusion drawn from 31 years of observation that had been integrated into their military planning at the foundational level. Earth could not send a note correcting it. Earth could not arrange a meeting to discuss it. The only mechanism by which that assessment could be revised was the arrival of the documented evidence fleet. I am not saying this to justify the fleet's existence retrospectively. I am saying it because this board's question, were non-military options exhausted, requires an honest accounting of what those options were and what they could have achieved. 11 months of diplomatic engagement achieved the following: 3 formal acknowledgments of receipt, 2 offers of redacted research summaries, and 1 expression of collegial appreciation for Earth's interest in xenobiology. 3 active cataloging stations continued to operate throughout those 11 months. The number of individuals in Dominion custody increased during the diplomatic period because the protocols were continuing to run. I will now give you my answer. The question as posed assumes a framework of measurement that I do not accept. Proportionality, as this board is using it, implies a scale. On one side the harm inflicted by the Dominion, on the other the response delivered by the fleet, and somewhere between them an acceptable ratio. I understand the framework. I have argued within it in briefings and in prior formal proceedings, and I can work within it if the board requires me to. But I want to first say clearly that I do not believe it is the right framework for what happened, and I want to explain why. The Vethrani Dominion did not commit an act of war in the conventional sense. They did not attack a military target. They did not engage Earth's forces. They did not destroy infrastructure or seize territory or issue demands. What they did was something more difficult to characterize within the standard frameworks that govern reprisal doctrine, because standard reprisal doctrine was built to address acts between states that recognize each other as states, that recognize each other's populations as populations, that operate within a shared understanding of what constitutes harm. The Dominion had published 214 peer-reviewed papers on the behavioral responses of human beings to conditions of captivity, fear, and isolation. They had done this for 23 years. They had received academic honors for it. None of the 214 papers, and I have read all of them, reflected any uncertainty about whether what the program was doing was appropriate. Not one. The lead researcher's acceptance speech for the Dominion's highest academic honor, which I have also read, described the specimen protocols as a landmark achievement in xenobiological understanding and expressed confidence that the program's longitudinal data would continue to produce insights for decades to come. This is what I mean when I say the standard framework doesn't fit. The Dominion was not hiding a crime. They were not concealing what they knew to be wrong. They had no framework in which what they were doing was wrong. They had a framework in which 4,887,304 human beings were research subjects, and that framework was coherent and internally consistent and fully integrated into their academic and administrative culture, and it had been running for 23 years when we found it. The fleet's response was not, therefore, simply a matter of proportionate reprisal in the sense that reprisal doctrine contemplates. The fleet's response was the insertion of a different framework. The fleet's response was the demonstration, conducted at scale and without ambiguity, that the Dominion's framework was not the framework that would apply, that human beings were not a research category, that 4,887,304 people were 4,887,304 people. That the Dominion's record, its careful, thorough, exemplary record, was going to be completed in a way the Dominion's researchers had not anticipated when they were photographing the responses of people in 4x2.5 meter cells. I dismantled the Dominion's military and administrative infrastructure across 11 systems because that infrastructure had supported, enabled, authorized, funded, and celebrated the specimen protocols for 23 years. The Bureau of Xenobiological Inquiry could not have run those stations without the administrative capital's authorization and the Fleet Command installation's protection. The academic journals could not have published those papers without an institutional culture that had no mechanism for questioning whether the research was permissible. The lead researcher could not have received his honor if there had been anyone in the Dominion's academic or governmental community who found the basis for that honor troubling. Everything was connected. Everything had enabled everything else. The fleet dismantled everything. I broadcast the Dominion's archive because the archive was the truth, and the truth had to be somewhere other than the Dominion's secured central servers if it was going to exist at all after the fleet finished its work. The archive was the Dominion's account of what they had done. I wanted the galaxy to have it. I wanted every academic institution that had cited the Dominion's xenobiology papers to receive the source material. I wanted every diplomatic body that had processed the Dominion's observer status applications to know what the Dominion had been doing during those applications. I wanted the Compact's administrative assembly, which had provided the observer status framework that the Dominion had used to deflect Earth's formal communications, to understand what that framework had sheltered. I wanted the record to be complete. That is my answer to the proportionality question. The fleet's response was proportionate to a 23-year program of treating 4,887,304 human beings as scientific data. It was proportionate because it addressed the program's full scope, the infrastructure, the institutional culture, the administrative architecture, the academic apparatus, and not merely the most visible symptom. And it was proportionate because it converted the Dominion's own record into its own indictment, which is the only form of justice that fits what the Dominion actually did. They built the most thorough record they could. We made certain it was complete. I have been asked whether I experienced any uncertainty about the fleet's operations. I will answer that question directly because I think it deserves a direct answer. I experienced uncertainty about a great many tactical and logistical matters during the 39 days of operations. I did not experience uncertainty about the fleet's mandate. I did not experience uncertainty about whether the documented evidence fleet should have been assembled, or whether the specimen protocols constituted an offense that warranted a response, or whether the scale of that response was appropriate. I experienced certainty on those questions with a completeness that I have not experienced regarding very much else in my life. I want to say one more thing, and then I am finished. The woman in Wing 1 of the System 2 station, the woman who had been in Unit 7 for 11 years and 3 months, was evaluated by the assessment screen's medical and psychological teams after her evacuation. I received the summary evaluation report on day 22, 3 days after she had been transferred to the Relief Authority's facility. The report was 3 paragraphs long. The third paragraph noted that she had asked the evaluating physician one question during their initial assessment session. She had asked whether it was over. The physician had told her yes. She had not said anything further. The physician noted that she had turned and faced the wall and had remained facing the wall for several minutes, and that the physician had remained in the room because this seemed like the correct thing to do, and that after several minutes the woman had turned back and had asked whether there was water. There was water. The physician gave her water. The report's conclusion, in the physician's clinical language, noted that the individual appeared to be processing the information that the situation had concluded, and that her prognosis for recovery would be assessed in subsequent evaluation sessions as she stabilized. I have thought about that report many times in the 6 years since the operation. I have thought about what it cost to produce 37 research entries about a person and not know, over 11 years and 3 months of producing those entries, that the person was a person. I have thought about the administrative capital's legislative chambers, which were well designed and clearly well maintained, and about the honors ceremony where the lead researcher accepted his award, and about the 11 hours it took to transmit the Dominion's archive on open channel frequencies, and about the confirmation receipts that came back from compact relay stations across the galactic community. I have thought about whether the record is complete. I believe it is. I believe the record is as complete as the fleet and the commission and the assessment screen teams could make it in 39 days of work with 677 warships and every forensic and documentary resource available to us. The record is complete, that is what I can tell you. The record is complete, and it will remain so because we broadcast it on every open channel available to us, and it has been in the galactic community's possession for 6 years, and it cannot be lost or archived or quietly allowed to fade. That is the answer to your question. I have nothing further to add to this testimony.